I think we both know what men are like.
My name is Anthony Fruin, and I was Stanley Kubrick's assistant.
Stanley Kubrick grew up in New York's Bronx district and went on to become one of the 20th century's greatest and most innovative movie directors, making classic films like Lolita, Dr. Strangelove, 2001: A Space Odyssey, Clockwork Orange, The Shining, and Spartacus, to name nearly all of them. Anthony Fruin, on the other hand, was born in Kentish Town in London, but grew up in the lush, green, post-war home counties.
I was born in September 1947, and I was brought up in Boreham Wood.
Were you interested in movies and books as a young boy?
From an early age, I was a voracious reader. Cinema films, not so much. We would go to the cinema to see things like Walt Disney's Davy Crockett film and whatever, but I didn't take it very seriously. In hindsight, I should have done, because my father worked in the film industry from the end of the war onwards, but I was always rather dismissive of the films he worked on. It was only much, much later that I realised he had actually worked on some pretty good films. You know, John Huston's Moby Dick, John Huston's Moulin Rouge, Inn of the Sixth Happiness, Dam Busters.
Where have all the flowers gone?
It was the height of the Cold War. When Tony wasn't chasing hearts of tin palm or stacking cans of tuna, he marched with CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. Tony was marching so that his generation could be free from the fear of nuclear holocaust, free to live and free to work.
I got the sack from this job because I went on the Aldermaston March, Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament March. Mr. Pollard, who was pretty right-wing, said, "Right, you're out of here."
But that passion for CND opened up an unexpected avenue. Stanley Kubrick's new film was showing in the suburbs, and it was causing a rumpus.
Love that bomb. Yeah, yeah. I got a strange love for that bomb.
It would speak directly to the young CND-supporting, recently sacked Tony.
I got a strange love for that bomb.
There was a buzz going around about a film called Dr. Strangelove. It was about nuclear war, and it got very good reviews, and quite a few of my friends said, "You should go and see it." Well, it was made by an American, and they speak, English or American English in it. In those days, I and my friends only ever went to see foreign language films. Buñuel, Antonioni, Fellini, Bergman. And so I was certainly a bit dubious about that. But anyway, I went to see it, and like most of my friends, was absolutely knocked out by this film. Biting satire, this black humour. It's okay to make films about mad scientists, but, nobody made films about mad politicians. Dr. Strangelove, in a way, rather upset our view of what America was, or a certain type of America. We went to see it quite a few times and just laughed and laughed. So that was the very first time I came across Stanley's name.
His father, meanwhile, was at MGM.
My dad said to me, "We're doing the pre-production on this new film, and we need a runner. Why don't you come down and see what's happening? Get a job." And I thought, Jesus, the last thing I want to do, is touch the British film industry. My dad kept on and on at me over the ensuing weeks, saying, "Come down and have an interview," and, blah, blah, blah. And I said something crass like, "Well, if it was Jean-Luc Godard, I might be interested," just dreadful. Anyway, in the end, I thought, well, the only way I'm going to get my old man off my back is to go down and have this interview. So he drove me down to the studios one Sunday morning and parked me in an office. This office was full of books. Books on surrealism and Dadaism and fantastic art and cosmology and UFOs. And I thought, geez, I wouldn't mind working here just to be able to read these books. Anyway, some guy walked through the office who I thought was the cleaner, came through one door, looked at me, disappeared through another door. I was reading Patrick Vorberg's book on Max Ernst that I'd only ever read about, and there was this wonderful book on the shelf. And then this guy appeared again and sort of looked at me, and he said, "Are you Eddie's son?" And he offered his hand and said, "I'm Stanley Kubrick." And he sat down opposite me and he said, "You're looking at the Wahlberg book on Max Ernst." And I said, "Yeah, I'm a fantastic artist." He said, "This film I'm doing, amongst other things, I've got to create believable extraterrestrial landscapes. And there are a lot of good ideas in Max Ernst." And he said, "Are there any other artists you know that I should be looking at?" Which rather knocked me for six. I mean, because since I'd left school, nobody had ever asked me anything, even the time. Anyway, we started chatting and he started telling me about this film, 2001. And we got talking about the possibility of extraterrestrial life and about flying saucers and about this and that. And we sat there chatting for about 2 hours. He said, "Well, your dad probably explained we need a runner on pre-production. Would you like to come and work for us?" And I said, "Sure." I said, "When do you want me to start?" He said, "How about 7 o'clock tomorrow morning?" I said, "You got a deal."
That must have been quite a whirlwind to find yourself on 2001. What did you do on the film?
A typical day, running messages, finding people who were hiding, reading scripts, sorting out the office. I mean, it was just so varied.
But there was one mundane office task of Tony's that had a significant impact on 2001 and would kick off a revolutionary trend in movie production.
Stanley was very concerned about what sort of music should 2001 have. People were suggesting, well, it was obvious, Stanley, electronic music. No. Music concrete, and all this sort of modern stuff. As the film was progressing, the MGM top brass in New York, from time to time, would like to come over and see where their money was actually going. So demo reels would be put together. Stanley would think, well, we need to run a music track. So he told me to go and get £300 out of the accounts department, grab the unit car driver, and go up to the more adventurous record shops in London, like Disc Curio in Shepherd Market and so on, and get some interesting records. And Stanley would stand beside the record deck. And what I had to do was take the LPs out of their covers and hand them to him, and then he would jump along tracks with the arm of the record player, seeing if he liked any of the music.
No!
And this is how he alighted upon the Strauss, Herbert von Karajan, and so on. And these music tracks would be laid against the demo reels for the MGM guys. Meanwhile, his wife, Christiana, had discovered the Ligeti music on what was then the third programme. And thus, the music that you see in 2001, that's how it came to be.
Stanley unlocked the very essence of Tony. He knew he had something more to give than going to the back of the shop for another can of tuna.
He was very good at picking out the face in the crowd. Whose potential wasn't being developed. About a week after I started work for him, somebody had sent him a film script. And he said, "Listen, I haven't got time to read this. Can you read it? Type me up a synopsis and a criticism of it so I don't have to do it." I said, "Well, I can't do that." He said, "What are you talking about? You can't do that." I said, "Well, I just can't." And I thought in my mind, I hadn't got one of these sort of posh voices, university, Oxbridge educated posh voice. And he said, "Well, listen, hold on a second. Let me ask you a couple of questions. You can read, can't you?" And I said, "Well, yes, I can. Surely I can read, yeah." He said, "When you read something, you have an opinion on it?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "If someone says to you, what was the story about, you could tell them?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "Also, I've noticed you can type." And I said, "Yes." And his very words were, "What's the problem?" And I was in a corner and there was no way out of that. So I read the script, typed up a synopsis and a criticism and gave it to him. He said, see, I mean, not a problem, is it? That was a good example of how he would sort of break something down into sort of elements. And what seemed an insurmountable problem at the beginning then sort of rather dissolved as a major problem.
Tony became one of Stanley's trusted assistants, a post he held for over 30 years and attended to the very nuts and bolts of the filmmaker's art.
Stanley was a stationery freak. He loved stationery. The stationery highlight of the year would be getting over the 2-inch thick catalogue from Goldsmith Brothers, the stationers in New York. I think it must have been in the mid-1980s. The first Post-it notes were available in this country. And they came in a 3x5 size in a kind of pale lemony yellow. And Stanley thought that this was one of the greatest inventions of modern times. And so we were soon awash in Post-it notes. After a few weeks, Stanley said, can you find out if they do them in other colours and other sizes? So we had 2 main stationers in this country. And I phoned them both up. Well, they both got back to me a day or so later and said, listen, that's all that's available, the 3x5, pale yellow, lemon. So I said to Stan, well, apparently, I mean, according to our 2 guys, that's all that's available. He said, you're talking to idiots. Phone up 3Ms, the people who produce the stuff. Speak to the guy who's in charge of it. I mean, you know. I spent almost a morning going from pillar to post at a Minnesota mining and manufacturing company. I eventually got through to some guy who was chief man on the Post-it note totem pole. And the first thing he said to me was, how did you get through to me? You know, this is a guy who'd never spoken to an end user or member of the public before. So I used Stanley's name, didn't mean a thing to him. What do you want? Why are you phoning me? I said, well, listen, a very simple question. We're all big fans of your 3x5 pale lemon yellow Post-it notes. The question is, what other sizes and what other colours are available? And there was an inordinate long silence, and then a big sigh. I thought, what's he going to say? And he said, if there were other colours and other sizes, there would be no end to it. And I told Stanley, and Stanley just burst out laughing. That rather sort of epitomised to Stanley that kind of middle-class English attitude. As Stanley said, an Englishman would rather say no than yes.
But then a series of mysterious messages led Tony to turn sleuth.
In the early 90s, I got a couple of phone calls from Warner Brothers at Pinewood Studios asking me to relay a message. When I saw Stanley later in the day, I said, can you give this chap a buzz? He's an old friend of yours. And Stanley said, I've never heard of this guy. I don't know anything about him. So we ignored it. Over the next few weeks, there were more calls like this coming from friends of Stanley Kubrick who were trying to get hold of him. I thought, there's something going on here. Anyway, another guy phoned up, but I phoned him back. And he said, you know, I'm a very dear, very close, very personal, intimate friend of Stanley Kubrick's. And he's changed his phone number and I have no means of contacting him. And I said, well, where did you meet Stanley Kubrick? He said, oh, in a wine bar in Kensington. I thought, Jesus, as if. I got a little more information out of him. He'd been back to Stanley's place. And I said, well, where is Stanley's place? He said, oh, it's in Canning Road in Wealdstone. I thought, what's Stanley Kubrick doing in Wealdstone? And the guy said, well, he's building this super secret mega new film studio in Harrow, and he's renting a place so he's nearer the construction. I then phoned up Harrow Library and got them to check in the electoral rolls to find out who was living at this address. And it was somebody called Alan Conway, which would prove to be an aptly Nabokovian name.
A certain Alan Conway was going about the place pretending to be Stanley Kubrick, But by a 1,000,000 to 1 chance that could only happen in the movies, it turned out that he was round the corner from where Tony used to live.
Now, after my son was born, we'd moved back from Kent. We didn't have two halfpennies to rub together. And we rented a little flat in Canning Road in Wealdstone. While we were living there, I became friendly with a woman who lived a couple of doors up called Eileen Gallagher. And after we moved out, I stayed in touch with her. So anyway, I phoned Eileen. I said, this guy, blah, blah, blah. Oh, she said, yeah, he's a very strange guy. The police are always turning up. And there were two guys trying to break into his front door last week. And I saw him frog marched by these two rough-looking guys into the bank lot, So I said, well, listen, can you keep an eye on him for us? And she surely did.
Tony was on to the con man, but things were escalating fast.
More and more people were coming out of the woodwork, with all sorts of extravagant stories, The guy who said that Alan Conway was going to bankroll an all-black production of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. Rock stars that he was going to get into Vegas. To use that phrase of Oscar Wilde's, life's exaggerations art can't afford. If you put those into a film or a novel, people wouldn't believe you.
How could Tony put the brakes on this runaway train?
This was beginning to get a little vexing to Stanley, but there was nothing he could do. We got some legal advice, and the legal advice was, well, you could serve Alan Conway with an injunction, but in order to get that injunction, you would have to get his victims to come into court and say, this guy promised me that for sex, or this guy promised me that, blah, blah. And, it's one thing to be conned, but you don't want to go into court and let the whole world know you've been conned. And anyway, even if you got an injunction, what could you do with it? Have a couple of people standing by him 24/7? I thought the only way out of this, really, is the oxygen of publicity. And I got on to a friend of mine and suggested he write a piece for Vanity Fair. I gave him a copy of my file on Alan Conway, which was now a couple of inches thick. So he wrote this piece of Vanity Fair, and Conway was exposed.
But being exposed only gave Conway more exposure.
So being the con man that he was, he thought, well, I better take advantage of this. So he started whoring himself out for interviews with the Daily Mail on TV and whatever, saying, I don't know what happened to me. I was taken over by this Stanley Kubrick, and I couldn't help myself. And being Stanley Kubrick, I had to pay for everything, and my life savings have gone. So he made some money out of it, exposed as a fraud.
As Tony said, if you put this in a film, no one would believe it. So that's what he did.
I used to look at this file in my filing cabinet and think, what's going to happen to this stuff? And purely as an exercise, I thought, I'll turn this into a screenplay. This was about 1997, and Stanley was still alive. And the last thing I would do with that is show that screenplay to Stanley, I could just see Stanley turning to me and saying, like the drill instructor in Full Metal Jacket, you've just signed your own death warrant, So I forgot about it. After Stanley died, I was sorting out stuff in the office. I came across the screenplay and read it, and I thought, this is quite amusing. I gave it to Christiana Kubrick, and she read it, and she said, I think it's very good. Why didn't you get it made? And I said, well, you've got no objections. She said, no, not at all.
The film was Colour Me Kubrick, and who better to play the man playing at being Kubrick than the man playing at being John Malkovich in Being John Malkovich, John Malkovich.
I'm Stanley Kubrick, the film director.
Stanley Kubrick?
The film director?
Yes, unless there's an animal.
In 1999, Kubrick was putting the finishing touches to another of his masterpieces when Tony was called to Kubrick's house for what he thought was a routine matter.
We'd finished shooting Eyes Wide Shut, and Stanley was virtually at the end of editing it. And he employed, I forget the guy's name, nice guy, he was an ex-copper, and Stanley employed him at nights just to sit in the caravan at the driveway to his house, just to keep an eye on things. I got a phone call from the guy Sunday morning about 7 o'clock. And he said, something's going on, I think you better come up to the house. And my immediate thought was, one of the dogs or one of the cats is ill, and we'll have to rush them up to the Cambridge Vet School. So, with a rather weary heart, I drove up to the estate. And I said, well, what's going on? He said, I don't know, but he said, the police have been here. And then I saw Katharina, Stanley's daughter, coming out of the house in tears. And I sort of rushed up to her and I said, what's going on? And she said, Daddy has died. Boy, that was a shock. A tremendous shock to all of us, because we thought Stanley would just continue forever. Just through sheer willpower, that would override any physiological problems Stanley might have. Just, the kind of Nietzschean will of it. But it wasn't so.
Stanley Kubrick remains one of the most outstanding and fascinating film directors of his era. Yet it turns out that both he and Tony are of a type.
Wasn't Kubrick very fond of typefaces? There was a particular kind of typeface he was very drawn to.
Well, we used to have arguments. I thought the whole world should be set in monotype Bembo Series 270, which is a beautiful serif face. Stanley thought the whole world should be set in Futura, a sans serif face. So we had those little arguments about that.